Stephen, that leaves us about half an hour for questions and comments.
I did 15 minutes more than I told you. I'm sorry.
No, we got started a little bit late. It's terrific.
Okay.
So we've got a lot of folks in this room with a lot of experience and different perspectives. The floor is yours. Comments, questions, critiques?
Nicely put, please. I'm an old man.
And maybe just identify yourself before you jump in. Go ahead, Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael Wilson from other faculties. Did a bit of a sort of a challenge function in terms of your thesis that the last 70 years were sort of, you used the word linear, economists would more often say exponential growth, and that we're suddenly at a period where uncertainty is much greater. I was trying to think of counter examples. So one of them was in the 1970s. The third world was the third world, and everybody worried that it would never develop. So was that not a point in the last 70 years where there really was kind of a qualitative change in the way the planet unfolded with the great rise in the middle class in China? You mentioned the uncertainty facing agriculture, but there was Rachel Carson that changed dramatically with fertilizers and pesticides, and then the evolution of the green revolution and the globalization of grain markets. So the Iowa farmers had to be more plugged into global markets and exchange rates and things, 20 years ago already. So that would be another example. When I think of the car and transportation, I think of Jane Jacobs and changing sort of the thrust of the highway builders. And just stop there.
No, I think you're. My very dear friend, Guy Stanley, and I have been working together for many years. Both of us are trained as historians. We're old-fashioned social scientists. That's what we really were. And it would be easy to take each of these lines and go back and find historical roots. I have no doubt that's so. What I was trying to do, I'm trying to do in this, is to build, in a sense, a tool. I think as social scientists, we're useful when you take a white sheet of paper and you draw a big black line on it. And you say, this is a tool for understanding, not for understanding, for using, and looking at a broad brush way of conceptualizing these two different periods. I have no doubt that historically, good historians will go back and forget. But there's a moment where we say when quantitative change becomes qualitative, when you can really talk about a new era. I don't want to say this is the beginning. 70 years worked well for me from 47 to 17. I would be willing to play with this a lot. But my point is that between this era and that era, there are significant differences that can be described in terms of exponential change or linear and non-linear. And that this could be a useful tool for helping us understand what's going on. I don't want to appear like Hegel or something like that, but that's really the goal. And of course, I acknowledge all of that. We could go back and look at the roots of all this. There's nothing that happens without, happens overnight. But at some point, the world changes. And I think we are coming into that world now. And the best examples I have are the ones I gave in terms of planning, whether it's in education, in agriculture, in manufacturing. Despite the changes you've talked about, by and large, the world moved forward on roughly the same tracks. Again, we could talk about changes that were made, but as we move, if we look beyond this, ahead of us, those tracks are very likely to be gone. So that's, I think, of course, you're right. And we could play with, and Guy's smarter than I am, always been, alas, many more of these things. And that would be fun, but at the moment, what I'm trying to do is something a little different, to say there is a significant, profound difference between these two eras. That would be my, but it's not an argument at all. It doesn't answer. It simply says, yeah, you're right. I'm just trying to do something a little bit different, if you don't mind.
So I have Guy and I have Philip. Guy.
Well, I actually like Stephen's talk quite a lot because I think he is opening the door on the most fundamental issues of the day, and they are this. Is the world still intelligible? Can we trace cause and effect, or effect back to cause? And if you think about it, this is a relatively modern and definable period in which people believed, largely there was a consensus around the idea that this was possible. You can think of Kant, and you go up until the 1920s and quantum mechanics, and suddenly there's this big philosophical discussion. Well, nobody resolved it terribly well, and now we're finding, my God, you know, as time moves on, it has started to infiltrate the texture of our lives. And the stuff, the world we are living in, is not the same as it was before, because we were unable to get our heads around the changes implicit in what was going on at the start of the 20th century. And as we finish with that and move to the 21st, we're totally baffled by this stuff. We don't know what leads to what, if we ever did. We're clear now that we're much less certain about that than we used to be. So I think you've succeeded in presenting us with a bunch of examples that show how in everyday life the world is becoming less intelligible. So maybe I'll stop there for now.
I think
For a but, guy.
No,
I figured there was a
well-
but.
No, there's no but. That's it.
Well, I think the bridge between the two comments would be this. We acted for a variety of understandable reasons from the 1940s, even until recently, as if these things were intelligible, plannable, and for the most part, the results suggested they were. Again, I think there's deep philosophical issues here that we didn't touch on, but the fact is, you could, you know, in most parts, whether it was Ukraine or harder, but certainly the Midwest United States and the prairies in Canada, you could put seeds down, you could water them, and you could be fairly certain, really very certain, that they would grow up, there'd be enough water, there'd be enough sunlight, and that the markets would exist in a relatively stable fashion, and you could get rid of the stuff, the translation. Those are really powerful thoughts, powerful theories.
Yeah,
and for the most part,
expect the bees to die.
well, for the most part,
Make fertilization possible.
well, but by and large, we're planning educational systems. Who planned them? We did what we did because they seemed to work so well. My high school classmates, I don't think the people in my high school planned this very carefully, but the track record showed that most of the people who graduated my high school got jobs. And by and large, they stayed in those jobs for their whole lifetime. That's not bad. So while we didn't look beneath the surface too deeply and didn't recognize perhaps the change that were going on, by and large, this thing worked pretty well. And it's not going to work very well. I don't want to say that's a negative judgment. It's going to be very different in the future, for better or for worse. It may be better, but it ain't going to be like that in the next while.
Philip.
I agree. Your scenarios for the future are plausible, although, as you noted, we're in a world of complete uncertainty when we're dealing with the future. I'm not sure I understand what you're doing with the part of the equation that we do understand, which is the past. I go back to your first comment when you outlined the automobile. And
Yeah.
how, yes, we have these hundreds of millions of vehicles currently with internal combustion engines and so on and so forth. What happens to them? Do they just disappear as these new vehicles you described? I don't think so, unless we're going to get the U.S. Army to blow them up for us. They're going to be there. Their price is going to go down. If the price of gasoline should go down, they'll become, there'll be a market for them.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to the past?
Well, these are really the uncertainties that lie ahead. I spent a lot of my life a couple of years ago writing about trucks, greener trucks. It turns out making trucks greener is not that difficult, But when you look at the replacement of trucks in North America, you're talking about a 10, 15-year period. Is the government going to buy all the old trucks and force people to buy electric? The way we sometimes think about this is not very useful. The fact is, for most time with automobile, transit, whatever it's going to be, we'll have a lot of different things on the table at the same time. Historically, this is used. If you really want to have some fun, you have to go back and look at the rise of the automotive industry, the transit industry at the turn of the century until Henry Ford comes along. And that is interesting. Does it give us any indication? In New York at one point we had steam, we had electric, new electric, we had horse-drawn, we had cable, for sure, transit systems, all in downtown Manhattan. We even had the first ones where were compressed air. It didn't work very well, but that was the first idea of compressed air. Boom, out of the cannon, underground. These things fell in, it happened. Internal combustion engines, almost everyone down here, Henry Ford's answer was not probably technologically the best. Many people thought that electric, even today, was electric or even steam. But Henry Ford, what he did do was design a car that people could buy. And that was the issue. It was not the quality of the technology. But I don't know. I mean, these are the kind of things, to me, these underground storage tanks is a big issue. How are you going to build, what happens to this stuff? What happens to the mom and pops who run all these things? We're talking about tens of thousands of them. I told my students a couple of years ago, when they figure this out, come to my grave and tell me, because I'm not going to be here. It's what I will do. Don't know. And these will be but for sure, there are lots of options for dealing with them. Is this a private issue? Is this a public issue? Do you find something to do with the gas? There are lots of possibilities. And all those are on the table at the same time. And for metro governments or state governments or provincial governments, trying to figure out what's the best scenario among the wide range of choices that are spread over a whole broad area, that's going to be quite a task. So yes, those are huge, hairy issues.
Question up front here.
Yes, sir.
Bob, if you want to maybe introduce yourself.
Yeah, Bob Walker, retired government science executive. Thanks very much here, Steve. And in thinking about this problem, I'd like to come at it from two perspectives. First, I very much agree with the thesis that we are in a materially different period of time today. And in fact, I wouldn't even say 70 years. I think it's in humankind, where we see the confluence of four megatrends. And you've mentioned them. We have climate change, we have population growth, we have an erosion of the world order, and we have science and technology. What is unprecedented is these are all moving forward at the same time. And by consequence, they are having interdependent effects.
Yeah.
And what's the bottom line? The world's going to surprise us at a higher frequency than we've ever experienced. We are going to be in a response and adaptation mode to that reality, because the ability to sort out this complexity and predict it on a time scale that's measured in something longer than days or weeks or months is going to be enormously problematic. And that, so the question is, how does humankind live in a world where adaptation is the norm, not something that occurs once in a lifetime? And that has every implication from how we educate, how we work, how we govern, and so on. The second perspective is this notion that we have this paradox at a world level. On the one hand, we've seen through the big themes of globalization and interconnectedness that the world is increasingly interdependent. Smaller world. Juxtapose that against the view that the world is increasingly fractured. Fractured along the lines of wealth distribution, ideology, religion. I mean, you can think of all of these political leanings. Democracy versus autocracies. You can think of all of these paradoxes, and in fact, some of the drivers that connected the world and made it smaller are actually exacerbating the fault lines. And there's the reality in which we sit. So that's kind of the problem statement. So what do you do about it is, I would think, where social sciences needs to help us enormously. And my view is that the old things that we've taken for granted, and your ability to plan and assume things are going to be linear, throw that out. Throw that out. What's the next big surprise we got to deal with? I don't know what it will be. Wait till you read the paper tomorrow morning, or you connect on social media and see what the latest tweet is, because that's the kind of dynamic that the future holds. And the next set of big surprises, who knows? It's going to be some emergent disease coming out of mosquito-borne diseases that we've got no blah, blah, blah. I mean, just it's there. That's the pace of the world we...
I think the problem, I think actually, and it seems to me that a possible scenario, I'll be very careful how to say this, is that in a democratic regime, people will become upset, bored, alienated from this kind of decision making, especially when you can't make long-term decisions or you do something wrong. I'll give you an example. We are now in New York desperate to have the gateway tunnels redone. Hurricane Sandy terminated the value, basically of the old tunnels, which were themselves 100-odd years old. 300,000, 400,000 people a day come across those tunnels. All of the Route 95, the northeast corridor that's on rail comes through those tunnels. They have to be rebuilt. If they don't, the United States, the eastern corridor is broken in two. And yet, we have a pretty good sense that within 20 years after repairing the tunnels, once again there will be storm surges like Hurricane Sandy or more. So what is the decision that is made? You don't build them, or you rebuild them with the idea that you know that this is or in simple terms, the 130-year-old bridges that break down once a day, the ones that turn and twist, you replace them, and you know for sure, give it 5 years, 8 years, and those will be underwater. How do you make a decision with that, and how do you get funding? How do you do that with that level of uncertainty? It really is, to me, wonderful, wonderfully complicated. And what is the risk-reward that you can do? And how can you avoid rejection of this kind of governance in periods of uncertainty by large parts of the population who feel they're getting screwed one way or the other, especially given the cleavages that you have talked about already opening up. I mean, I think that's a humdinger. Well, that's a humdinger. I like that. And I don't know what the answers would be. Monica's smarter. Let her work it out in the ISSB.
If not, I've got questions. But other questions? Yes, please. And maybe just identify yourself and then Ruby out. So start at the back and then come
You go first.
Really, really enjoyed your talk. All sorts of questions, but what I want to ask you, and it applies more to the United States, is what ties people together. And I remember my history classes in American history.
God, by God, thank you.
Talked about, I remember a book was called People of Plenty.
Yes.
What about the American dream and psyche of people living in the United States? You needed to have something that tied people together, and so you have the Statue of Liberty there, and you arrive, and you think you're going to make it in the United States. And that book was on all the mandatory reading list, and I was reading it again the other day. People thought they would improve their lives, either, as you say yourself, from the high school, but, in different quarters of American society. Do you think that still exists?
No. No.
You need to find out also those.
Well, quite clearly, the myth that bound people together after the closing of the frontier. I mean, we talk about that as though it were just a book, a funny event. It turns it's a very serious thing, because Americans could walk away from whatever and walk to the frontier, or they could come in a boat and go to the frontier. But the myth beyond that was of upward mobility. It probably wasn't true, or not as true. In my own case, certainly, my grandparents, immigrants, poor, illiterate. My father became a well-known physician. I was a professor at Harvard. Ain't bad. But I think that by and large, it was never as successful. Again, we have a feeling. Canadians have a feeling. We all have a lot of people went to college. But as I say, in 1957, when I graduated from high school, 4% of white males went to college. And when I tell that to people, they're shocked. So that upward mobility was, if it was a myth, we could act as if it were true, and Americans did. Well, and it doesn't. It no longer works. It doesn't work anymore. And I think that I think, again, go back to my high school day. The security that these people felt is stunning compared to the insecurity that young people feel today. My high school friends were absolutely certain. 8 hours a day, 25 years, own your house, your retirement, your health care, your kids go to college. And it turned out to be true. At the 50th, our 50th reunion, at the 10th, 20th, I liked the high school. The 10th, 20th, 30th, these people were frankly drubs. At the 50th, they had been retired for 15 years. They had gone back to school. They got degrees. They traveled. They were utterly cool. They were not the greatest generation. They were the luckiest generation. But I think for them and for the standard from Horatio Alger to the Jewish theme movies after World War II, everybody made it. There is no way that people are convinced that that's the case today. Indeed, the growing gap between the richest, the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, and everybody else is everyone knows that. And I think that has been more than anything else. That's the sense of upward mobility, the possibility of upward mobility, and the realization today that it's impossible, which then produces huge blame. It's the Jews. They've always been there. It's the immigrants. It's this, it's whatever. Because you need someone to, and certainly it's politicians who are all with their hand in the pot. I think that's the big issue.
That's a major change philosophically.
Oh, I think, again, we don't have to be proven, it doesn't have to be proved that the myth was not necessarily true, but we believed it and we acted as if it were true.
Yeah, it was false.
Yes.
False consciousness.
Yes, but it worked.
Gatsby curve and all that stuff.
It worked. And is it finding her as if that did work, and people did. I mean, that was a source of what's the right word? Not contentment, but acceptance. You could accept the system because you did believe that existed, even if you didn't know anybody. You did believe it, and I think today, no one believes it.
All the rest of the people who voted for Trump.
I think it's one of the reasons they voted for him, was the
those expectations failed. They didn't have jobs.
Well, I think that the reason they voted was because they're angry, and he crystallized that anger. But again, that's in the United States.
David, we got a question here that was in the queue ahead of you, and then David, you're up.
I'm Derek Ireland, a local consultant, ex-public servant.
Hi, Derek.
Do a bit of teaching when they really need somebody at Carleton. I'm interested in your 70 years, and I've been playing around with the same ideas as some of the research I'm doing. The 70 years are really talking about North America and Western Europe. I've been lucky enough to have been studying Asia for almost my entire life, and for visiting and working in Asia for almost 40 years. And they are not on a 70-year plane. They seem to be more on a, I'd say they're in the 40 to 50 years. I like your 70 years, actually. What I think we might be finding is that some of the things that are unintelligible to us, to quote Guy Stanley, is sort of just being figured out by them. And they're coming out of different worlds and so on. The folks I've worked with there over that 40-year period are smart, if not smarter than we are, partly because they've had to deal with a much more difficult period. But given that we might have 20 to 30 years of that kind of thing from Asia, is that something that might help the rest of us to sort of try to figure out what's intelligible or what to do with the problem we're facing now? Because they are making progress.
Okay. I'll tell you what my answer is, but I want to make sure you understand. I am looking at how to talk about this in a way, tools rather than deep digging into the history. My sense, I would say, is that no doubt about Japan, no doubt about emerging Southeast Asia, and no doubt about China as well, lagging, but that the model they looked at was still the model of the United States and Western Europe. The technology, now China is relatively different in the same sense that Stalin was, but Lenin, I mean, it was still that. There wasn't a lot of stuff that, the options were still fairly limited. That's what they were doing. They weren't imitating us, but they were working within the same planning framework. I think the Chinese now are coming up with very different answers. The Japanese, again, was fairly much like us with the Japanese differences. But if you look at the technology, the use of technology, the basic planning, the Japanese education system is much different, but the idea was the same. train people at this level to be good citizens. Now, they may be, the difference is where a lot of the guys graduating from college were 7-11 salarymen, but the system was not all that different. I think we're now may well be coming to a parting of the ways, mainly with China. China becomes the most interesting. I don't think Japan's that interesting in terms of differences. China begins looking at these matters differently. If you look at AI, the Chinese have got something different by the hand, mainly because the number of people. What they can do with deep learning is beyond anything we can do, and they are enlarging that mass exponentially. The Chinese have no sense yet, I think, of a computer that thinks like a person. That's well beyond where we are. But their ability to use deep learning to do things that we are barely able to think of here is very impressive. But again, it's very interesting to say, yes, in a way that's true, and my model really does focus more on Europe and the United States. I understand that. That was the world until not too many years ago. But this is the kind of thing that would be fun to talk about and improve my reading of all this. And yes, you may well be, that may be a place I should go. Thank you. David.
Last question to you.
Well, sort of a comment on this question of the American dream or the Canadian dream or the North American dream, and the extent to which the Trump phenomenon is a nativist phenomenon. It's people, white folks, who bought into that and got themselves stuck in a rut with globalization and don't see any future for themselves. I wonder if you ask the same questions amongst the Indian diaspora in the United States, the Chinese community in the United States, even the Latino community in the United States, who, if you look at them, are all showing all the signs of educational achievement, moving up the income ladder, et cetera, and in fact, to some extent, crowding out some of the native population. And you certainly see that in Europe as well. I watched this in Britain. An awful lot of the anti-Brexit stuff is Paggy bashing, and we're fed up with these immigrants around the corner taking our jobs, even if they aren't taking our jobs. And so the dream, in a sense, is broken, but it's broken for the more traditional parts of the population, and not necessarily for the newer parts of the population. And there's certainly lots of evidence of that being true in Canada, where some immigrant communities have done extraordinarily well, and are still continuing to do extraordinarily well, and for whom the same sort of aspirations and hopes are still there. I don't think that makes the analysis any easier. It makes it slightly different. And you see this throughout U.S. history, the rise of nativism. I can't stand the Irish coming into Boston, and the bloody Italians are doing this, and the damn Jews are doing that. And this has come up every sort of 30, 40 years, quite often quite violently in U.S. history.
Well,
I'm not saying this isn't different, but I wonder how much different.
Well, three things. One, the worm in the bud, to use the Victorian term, in the U.S. has been the black community for all sorts of reasons. We are reminded occasionally of the inequality that continues to exist on that particular line. Second is that, again, one of the operating beliefs was that as the pie expanded, everyone got a bit more. Someone may get more, but but everyone got more. And the expanding pie was another myth, but it was very useful and said that everyone benefits from this. We hang together and everyone does better. Again, and finally is that, yes, periodically people have always been in the United States, have been such. One of the interesting failures in the United States and Canada is that we still think in terms of white, brown. I mean, the non-white Latino is a weird, that one I can never figure out how you figure that one out. But what we don't talk about at all in the U.S. in the census is intermarriage. What we're going to see in the United States is everyone becoming a bit browner, because the intermarriage between Latino and white and Asian and white is big deal. Less between black and white, which is an issue in itself. But if we could easily stop talking about white minority if we called people, white people who married, say, Latinos, white rather, or mixed. I mean, we could get over that because the world is changing. But again, this is where I think the notion of the pie isn't expanding. Someone must be getting more than me of a declining pie. And I think on the basis of deeply institutionalized racism, not just the black community, which that's the foundation of this, but constant renewal of this, Irish, Jews, whatever you say, that notion that the pie isn't expanding, that the belief that myth, it's no longer even an operating myth, like upward mobility, it's the other side of that, is devastating. It's devastating to an environment which prides itself, again, not accurately, but prides itself on being relatively ultra mobile, where we think that people have, you could climb up. It's the not Dick Whitting, that's London. What's his name? Horatio Alger. That everyone has a
From rags to riches.
From rag, and this is part of the game. Everyone can do this, and yes. And how does this play out when the sense of your gain is my loss? Or
if you ask that question in California, what kind of an answer would you get? I think you get a different answer.
Well, I think the first thing you get by relatively informed people is there should be two states, that the North and the South are very different, and that you can't ask this at a California level. That doesn't make much sense because they're very different in how they view. I mean, you go to Los Angeles where Latino is near a near majority, notwithstanding intermarriage and so on, and you go up to the North where there are no immigrants at all, and they would still vote for Trump. It's an interesting. Yeah. So. No. Well, you got all sorts of pockets in the. I mean, Orange County has gone Democratic. Yeah, but I mean, okay, but I mean, again, I think there's two different. And so I don't know. I don't know. It is very clear also that the current regime gains wind by making these things, by dealing with this, by making it worse. I mean, that's a very unpleasant. This is just is it a Hungarian thing? But I don't see an easy answer, given the institutionalization of inequality at a level that's so stunning that's really difficult to get your hands around. The business of the corruption about getting into colleges. Yeah. Most people have talked about that. This is no big deal. It's corrupt the whole way through. If you really want to do it, you can give a lot of money by giving a library. And you get in for sure. You don't have to make it under the table. And people have enough money to do that, or whatever. Or even more simply, your kid gets to take all these SAP, not of it, but what's the SAT primer courses that kids who have to work don't. Or we learned in New York, giving a kid free tuition at CUNY doesn't mean anything if they don't get money for books and dormitory rooms and so on because they can't afford it anyway. I mean, the hokiness, which it becomes more transparent now, given the. So it's hard to see good outcomes here, and it's very interesting. You talk about who becomes the biggest opponent of educational efforts to balance, to make it more balanced. The Asians in New York are the ones who are most opposed to the New York colleges trying to get more balance, using race and income as metrics for getting into college. It's as understandable as can be, and it's as sad as it could be. But that's if you don't believe that upward mobility is diminishing, that the pie is not enlarging, it's hard not to have pretty bad feelings.
You don't get to ask the last question anymore. You took us into a very negative place. So I'm going to call this to a close and thank everybody for coming. But what I did want to say is thank you, Stephen. There are so many of us in this room, many of whom I've had conversations with. We're all kind of grappling with things are changing, and the changes are changes not of quantity, but changes of quality, changes of kind. And this gives us a really interesting way of beginning to think about these issues. As you can see around the table, lots of folks I think would add some nuances and tweaks here and there. But the timing of this couldn't be better for us at the Institute. Of course, our next step is Bob's question, so what do you do about it?
Yeah.
But framing up the problem is extraordinarily important, and Stephen, I wanted to thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on that.
Well, thank you on all levels, personal, given this very awkward time in my life, and professional, and social, and so on, for inviting me back. And Monica, you are a dear, dear friend. And Ruby, and David, all good friends, but Ruby, thank you particularly for coming. It means a lot to me.
All right.